A colleague in our diocese is the nephew of one of St. Faustina Kowalska's spiritual directors, and his life has been influenced by the theme of and devotion to the Divine Mercy. And after studying the life of St. Kateri Tekakwitha, he was quite struck by the similarities in her spiritual life and Faustina's. As well, last year we discussed some of the remarkable similarities surrounding the origins of the image of St. Kateri that was painted and the Divine Mercy image. They both involved a rather rare heavenly request for a painting to be made, and the request in both cases was made in remarkably similar words. Now, I discussed all this with my colleague Father Andras, who listened carefully and then said, "All great saints lead us to the mercy of God." Hence the title of our conference this year, St. Kateri leads us to the mercy of God. Now, the theme of the conference this year is giving special emphasis to the Sacrament of Reconciliation, where we encounter the mercy of God. Every time we turn around, we appear to see the relevance of our saint. After she went to the St. Francis Xavier mission in Quebec in order to be able to practice her faith in peace, Kateri took the sacrament of healing and encounter with the mercy of God quite seriously. Her contemporary biographers, that is, those who knew her personally, write that she went to confession approximately once a week and sometimes spent an entire hour preparing herself, and that she expressed her sorrow in such a genuine way that they came to the conclusion that this could only be the work of the Holy Spirit. Now, I don't think we can or should imitate the great saints in everything they did, except perhaps with the careful guidance of a spiritual director. Frequency of confession is an example of this. There's sometimes people go to confession once a week who are not really ready for this. In some cases, it might be a case of excessive scrupulosity. In other cases, it can be because they're confessing other people's sins. That does happen. Now, most people have the experience of confessing some of the same things on some kind of regular basis. That's not unusual. But we need to keep in mind, if that's the case, that when we go to the Sacrament of Reconciliation, we're not just getting rid of our sins. We're seeking to grow in our relationship with God. Now, I mentioned Kateri's practice in forming her conscience so carefully for this sacrament because we can turn to her as an example and an intercessor who can help us approach this sacrament of healing and mercy in a more meaningful way. Last year I was asked to give a workshop which was entitled The Striking Relevance of St. Kateri Tekakwitha. It can be found on the Tekakwitha Conference's YouTube channel as a background for this. When asked again this year, I thought a part two would be an opportunity to develop some of the themes introduced a year ago, as well as some new ways which should suggest the incredible relevance of our saint. Now, as mentioned last time, even though Kateri has been formally canonized, we're still very much in the process of getting to know who she is and who she is meant to be for us. Many of her virtues speak with force today. She seems to be strong where we are weak. For example, her commitment to simplicity of life and solitude, the rare heights of contemplative prayer that she reached. She's one of the greatest contemplatives in the history of North America that we know about. As well, her courage and love in response to persecution, her penitential life, her chastity, her intense focus on the world to come, and her holy and miraculous death, her beautiful death, are some of the ways in which she speaks to us today. Now, while Kateri's importance for the indigenous peoples of North America and their privileged relationship with her is well established, and her growing role as a patroness for the environment is also very well known, there's been little discussion about some of her timely and exceptional virtues. The reason why she's a saint of universal significance, and what I'd like to focus on in this time in three ways. Now, first, while her human friendships were important to her, and they were something she chose carefully, her true and spiritual friendships, Few things are more precious to St. Kateri than solitude and being alone with God. I'd like to take a special look at this theme in light of our experience during the pandemic, during the past year. Now, many people, not everyone of course, but many people learned an important lesson about the value of solitude, properly understood during this time. And like Kateri, this lesson was first forced on us, but over time the spiritual potential of being alone with God led some people to a deeper encounter with their Creator and to new growth in the spiritual life. Now, are we going to remember this lesson? Do we really want to go back to the way everything was before? You know, we often heard or still hear the phrase, return to normalcy. Now, was everything really that normal? Over the last year or so, many people found themselves able to devote more time and attention to the important things in life. Even some less important things worked for the better. Most people I know preferred the pandemic's Zoom draft last year, seeing the commissioner in his den, a coach feeding his dog in his kitchen, and the best receiver drafted in his Old Spice bathrobe, only to be very disappointed this year by the return of the high-tech show and all the noise. Now, secondly, in the descriptions of St. Kateri's life, we have detailed portrayals of the everyday experiences of North America's only canonized laywoman in her interaction with the world around her. Now, we do not have many such glimpses of great lay saints. She lived the same life as her people did. After she went to the mission, she continued to live in close proximity to many others. She participated in the winter hunt and carried out the same responsibilities that all the women did. So she wasn't in church praying all day or living as if she was called to live in a convent, the consecrated life. In fact, accounts of her life turn out to be one of the most complete illustrations we have of how life according to the Spirit is compatible with an intense interaction with the world at large. Now, third, by the grace of God, Kateri grew in holiness and emerged victorious from her notable spiritual trials. Now, few things prove the existence of God than the life of a great saint, and so we often see them thrust into the spiritual battle. It reminds me of how a superior of St. Faustina once said to her, "Sister, along your path, sufferings just spring out of the ground. I can see that Jesus has a hand in this. Be faithful to the Lord." So what I'm referring to is not the extraordinary forms of the spiritual battle that the media loves to focus on, but rather the ordinary spiritual battles we deal with every day, and the temptations we face, and choices we have to make between good and evil, throughout the day. In a very real sense, these seemingly small, everyday spiritual battles are potentially more dangerous for us than the dramatic exorcisms we see in the movies. Now, in addition to the persecutions that Kateri suffered earlier in her life, when she was on the winter hunt, she experienced the surreal trial of a false accusation and rash judgment. Now, the way she responded offers, I think, an outstanding model of the love and virtue that can counteract the kinds of temptations Christians especially face today. I'd like to take a look at these ways in which Kateri is relevant today, with an emphasis on the 6 months or so that she spent on the annual winter hunt, because it's a unique and significant period in her life, a time which I believe provides a deeper look at her relevance today and creativity of spirit. This period of time, for what it's worth, was also not part of the discussion last year. Now, this hunt probably took place after her first Christmas at the mission, so that would be the winter of 1677-78. It was the practice of her people to spend most of the winter on these hunts and away from the village. The rest of the year they would live off the preserved meat. Now the hunts were more relaxed in nature compared to the rest of the year in the village, and they are described as a time of feasting. Now the priests did not go on the hunt, too bad for them, but remained in the mission village. So there was no mass available during this time for their people, who did come together for morning and evening prayer every day. Now the defining image of St. Kateri during this period of time is the shrine she made for herself on a riverbank, which consisted primarily of a cross that she made from a tree. Which brings us to our first theme, solitude. Now, Kateri's parents and brother died of smallpox when she was around the age of 4. One of the symptoms for her of this disease was an extreme sensitivity to light. She had to wear a blanket over her head whenever she went outside and spent many hours indoors and alone during her youth. Now this, of course, at first was not her choice, but over time she became extremely attracted to the spiritual potential that solitude presented her with. And during the hunt, she carved out time alone with God in very creative ways. As the Vatican summary document for her cause of canonization states, she did as many extraordinary things in solitude as she had in the village. Now, every day, Kateri would pray alone before dawn for a lengthy time. After the morning prayers, which everyone said together, the men would eat their breakfast. That's when Kateri saw her chance to make a spiritual communion. And so she would go to her shrine on the riverbank to do this. Now, this was the same time that Mass was being said in the village, and so she made a point of praying for the Mass intentions of the priests during these spiritual communions of hers. After this, she would work until sunset and then join the hunting community in their night prayers, and, believe it or not, would sometimes return in the evening to her retreat on the river. Now, sometimes the terms solitude, loneliness, and being alone are used interchangeably, but in Christian understanding, they really are different things. Solitude, in the Christian sense, refers to intentionally separating oneself from others in order to devote oneself to prayer. It's a state of spiritual potential. I think one of the best definitions we have is from St. Augustine, who says that this state is when we, in our innermost soul, can only find our true home and rest in God. And here in the depths of our being, only God can penetrate. Solitude in this understanding, then, is that state where we are never alone. And it's a state where we can grow spiritually. Well, it's interesting that the great philosopher Aristotle, long before the time of our Lord, came to the conclusion that an indication of goodness or virtue in a person was their ability to enjoy their own company and being by themselves, because they're at peace with themselves and well aware of their own joys and sorrows. In contrast, he maintained that those who are not good or not virtuous always want to be around other people and avoid their own company, a sign that there's some kind of internal contradiction or a kind of civil war in their souls. Now, solitude is different than simply being alone. Again, it's a time of spiritual potential. It's different than the painful emotion or feeling of loneliness, something we all experience in different degrees. There seems to be a current epidemic of holiness, which is ironic given the ways our world appears to be so interconnected. It reminds me of one of the Pink Panther movies when Inspector Clouseau's assistant asks him if he ever gets lonely. And he said, "No, I'm on the internet." Anyway, this experience of holiness, which is so much part of the human condition, illustrates how we are made to be in community or in communion with others, and that the spiritual depth of solitude always needs to be balanced by the support we receive and give to others. Well, prior to the pandemic, I don't think too many people would say that ours was a time that was too focused on solitude. It seemed to be a time of great restlessness, a time of living as if God did not exist, as if we were the creator. That doesn't appear to have changed all that much, but many people over the past year learned to take advantage of the spiritual potential of solitude during this time, as well as a growing sense of solidarity with family and friends. Now, do we really want to return to all the frantic activity and fragmented way of living that we had prior to this time in our lives? I think the question of solitude is relevant now in a new way. And then what can we learn from the example of our saint? Well, in practical terms, if we haven't done this already, we need to find a time and place to pray, free from distractions, our own personal shrine. Ideally, that would be in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, but when that's not possible, which is often the case, a place in our home without external noise, which helps us to quiet our inner noise and whatever may be preoccupying our mind. Then we can begin to pray or read with attention, pray to the Holy Spirit for guidance, and put ourselves into the presence of Christ. We also need to find the best time to pray, the time when you are at your best. Now, we may not be called to get up exactly as early as Kateri did, like around 4 a.m. or earlier, but usually first thing in the day is the time, since this sets the tone for the rest of the day. Now, prayer at the end of the day similarly sets the tone for our night. If we go to bed with our head full of distractions, it's often harder to pray the next day or do anything the next day. Now, Kateri, the laywoman, at the end of his exhortation on the vocation and mission of the lay faithful in the church and in the world, Christe Fidelis Laici, Christ's faithful people, St. John Paul II writes, quote, "We can conclude by reading a beautiful passage taken from St. Francis de Sales, who promoted lay spirituality so well. And speaking of devotion, that is, Christian perfection, or life according to the Spirit, he presents in a simple yet insightful way the vocation of all Christians to holiness, when emphasizing the specific form with which individual Christians fulfill it." Then the Holy Father goes on to quote from Francis de Sales' Introduction to a Devout Life, which was first published approximately 50 years before Kateri was born. Now here Francis describes, I'm paraphrasing, how God commands all Christians to bring forth the fruits of devotion, each according to his or her vocation, their employment, and their strengths or gifts. For example, he mentions the difference between, tradesmen, housekeepers, leaders, widows, daughters, married women, all practice life according to the Spirit in different ways. Francis goes on to say that's an error to say that life according to the Spirit is incompatible with the life of a soldier or a mechanic or a life of public service or a married life. He writes, quote, "It is true that a purely contemplative, monastic, and religious devotion cannot be exercised in such ways of life. But besides these three kinds of devotion, there are several others that can properly bring to perfection those who live in the secular state." Now, while great attention has been given to the lay vocation since the Second Vatican Council, we've seen the canonization of more lay people. In the biographies of Kateri written by her contemporaries, we have what remains the very rare description of the everyday life of a lay saint. In detail, we see her interactions with her friends, her peers, her relatives, and her in her everyday responsibilities, such as during the hunt or at work at the fields, or in her craft work. Now, these accounts of her life, we see that sweet, kind, humble, prayerful Kateri did not spend all of her time in the soft confines of the church, but was very much in the rough and tumble of the world around her. Now, our spiritual heritage, we have works that were written by the great saints that are considered to be spiritual treasures for all times. Some of them are autobiographical. While all of these books can have considerable meaning or application for everyone, almost all of these were written by or for those who are living in a monastic or contemplative or some other form of consecrated life. There's really only one great spiritual classic that is written specifically about the lay vocation in the world. This is St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to a Devout Life. Now, Francis died approximately 25 years before Kateri was born. He was educated by the Jesuits, who were missionaries to New France at the time that she was alive. And many of these missionaries had a devotion to Francis, and even named a mission after him at Sillery, Quebec, a few years after Kateri died. Now, his introduction is a practical book with lots of practical examples. He begins by describing true devotion, or as the Holy Father liked to say, life according to the Spirit, and said that this is characterized by the thorough love of God. Now, we're all a work of progress. We all have areas in our spiritual lives to work on. We all fall in some way or fail in some way, of course. But what Francis is warning about is how many people, quote, by covering themselves with certain external actions, make the world believe that they are truly devout, but in reality are phantoms or statues of devotion. Now, in the figure of Kateri, we see the principles of Francis de Sales coming to life and have a complete description of what life according to the Spirit entails for a lay person. You know, she seems to fulfill everything he writes about. She's a spiritual director, a rich prayer life with many dimensions, a focus on growing in the virtues such as humility, patience, meekness, obedience, chastity, and she valued true friendship, something de Sales wrote a lot about, among other things. Now, Kateri had her struggles and temptations, but did her best to live a thoroughly Christian life, knowing as she did how extremely pleasing this is to God. Now, Kateri's experience on the hunt illustrates in living color how the devout life is compatible with every state and occupation in life. Her contemporary biographer and spiritual director, Father Pierre Cholinek, writes, quote, God doubtlessly wished that she should sanctify herself in the woods by the beautiful example she gave, that virtue may be practiced equally in both these places. She continued the exercises of piety she had practiced in the village. Similarly, Kateri's friend, Father Claude Chauchater, says, quote, she continued the same exercise of devotion in the forest which she had practiced in the village, and substituted for those she could not do by others of her own invention, or more often by those which were suggested to her by the Holy Spirit. During the winter hunt, Kateri engaged in all the ordinary work that women did on the hunt. She collected meat from the kill, made clothing out of deerskin. She may have been first in line to volunteer for gathering wood, because if she got this assignment, she knew she could be alone with God. You know, I'm almost 100% certain that she would be the first in line to volunteer. As always, she was careful to carry out her everyday responsibilities well. Her work was helped by her devotion, not hindered by it. And that's a sign of someone living life according to the Spirit. You know, if someone is in church all day to the neglect of their family or their job, that's a sign that something's off or out of balance. A devout life supports and complements our occupation, our responsibilities, our vocation. Now, Father Scholinek also writes that Kateri, quote, never became so attached to work, either in the woods or in the cabin, that she forgot her shrine. Now, this is another subject in itself, especially when we find ourselves overwhelmed with our so-called responsibilities or busyness. It's then perhaps more than ever that we need to pray. That is when we experience one of the miracles of prayer. When we withdraw from our so-called busyness to be alone with God and pray, He blesses and multiplies our time, just like He did that small boy's loaves and fishes in the Gospels. The spiritual battle. Now, Kateri made the most of her time on the hunt in terms of her life of prayer. However, she was not happy being away from the sacraments, the support of the priests and the church she loved to pray in, and she could not have been happy with an unusual trial that she experienced near the end of the hunt. In retrospect, this trial, where she was the victim of a false accusation, appears to have had a spiritual dimension. Now, accounts of this incident describe a man who had been out hunting for most of the day and then returned to the camp late. He was so tired that he didn't even want to eat before going to bed and just, quote, threw himself down on the first place he could find. When his wife woke up in the morning, he wasn't around, and she saw him sleeping next to Kateri's bed. Now, later in the day, he increased his wife's suspicions when he said he needed someone to help him pull his canoe out of the woods, and that it would be probably Kateri that would help him. And he said this because he knew that, well, Kateri was always willing to help out. But in his wife's mind, the deal was now sealed, and she came to the conclusion that some kind of long-standing relationship was taking place. Interestingly, this woman was known to be quite spiritual and very wise, and she did have the sense initially not to make this public, at least at first. But when the winter hunt was over, she returned to the mission and told the priest in charge what she thought had happened. Now, it's most ironic that Kateri Tekakwitha, the Lily of the Mohawks, so named because of her great chastity, was, for the second time, accused of not being as innocent as everyone thought. And looking back at the incident, Scholinek writes, "It is God's way with His elect to put their virtue to the test and to render it perfect in the fire of tribulation, allowing it to be blackened by slander, as gold in the furnace." Now, the priest in charge of the mission told Kateri about the accusation. She denied it in her usual peaceful way without showing any emotion. This was not good enough, though, for her accuser and those who had now somehow become aware of this. Still, Kateri trustfully surrendered the whole matter and her reputation to God. She didn't try to discover who said this about her. And the missionary writes, quote, "She allowed the matter to die away as though it had concerned someone else. All the vengeance she took was to pray to God for them." It would not be until after the events of Kateri's miraculous death and all the miracles that took place at the time that God rewarded her. Those who were so quick to defame her were moved by these events, and then they themselves started to publish all her virtues and the beautiful examples she had given them. They prayed to Kateri after her death, and the woman who judged her spent several years, quote, mourning her mistake. And the very same missionary who first listened to the accusation now had to assure the accuser of her own forgiveness. Now, earlier in her life, prior to having to flee to the mission in order to practice her faith and freedom, Kateri responded to persecution and opposition in much the same way. She also considered considerable opposition for her decision not to marry and her desire to preserve her love for God alone. Now, this was unprecedented for a woman in her culture. Her relatives were understandably confused or bewildered. It's interesting that this opposition continued after Kateri moved to the mission. And it appears that her spiritual mother and Kateri had more than one argument about this. And it's here that we have some rare glimpses of Kateri getting frustrated and hurt. Now, there's not much cultural support today for men and women who decide to pursue a religious or priestly vocation, or simply to live out their faith more deeply. In addition, it's pretty much a given that when someone does this, they will encounter some kind of mysterious opposition. It reminds me of a man who decided at some point in his life that he wanted to fast on a regular basis, moderate fasting. He decided to do this every Friday. And every Friday, from within his own household, a person would say to him, "Are you still fasting? Are you sure you're not going to eat this beautiful dessert I prepared for you?" That sounds pretty innocuous, but I can guarantee that was the devil himself. When we encounter evil in our everyday life, our response is not with human weapons, but with the sacraments, prayer, the virtues. This is precisely where Kateri's thorough love of God shines. She offered herself to God totally. She was totally in love with God and had complete confidence in Him, not in herself. All the many different ways that she sought to live out her faith by the grace of God led her to victory over evil. In conclusion, when St. Kateri Tekakwitha was canonized on October 21st, 2012, a banner replica of a painting made of her by her friend and biographer, Father Claude Chauchuter, hung in St. Peter's Square. He said he was inspired to paint her holding a gold cross because of her great love for the cross and the way in which she appeared to her spiritual mother, Anastasia, after her death. Now, the official summary of her cause published by the Sacred Congregation of Rites notes that 1 week after her death, Kateri appeared to Anastasia, holding a cross that Anastasia said, quote, was more brilliant than anything else. And from it there shone forth so much light that she thought there could be nothing more beautiful upon earth. Then Kateri said to her, "Mother, look at this cross and see how beautiful it is. It was the source of all my happiness during my life, and I counsel you to make it yours also." It was no coincidence that the defining image of Kateri while participating in the winter hunt was the shrine she made out of a cross. She knew that the way of the cross leads us to the heart of the mystery of God, that God is love, God is mercy that is inexhaustible. Now, God calls us to make sacrifices, but these are always to be seen in the light of His mercy, the fact that He wants to bless all of us with good things. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that a hard road leads to life, and that those who lose their life will find it. John's Gospel, that a dying seed brings forth abundant life. The Gospel from Mark, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, there is no one who has left brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100-fold." Now, the same could be said about Kateri's pursuit of solitude and life of prayer, which at first glance might seem like a waste of time, or a sacrifice of time, I should say. The way of the cross. And one of the great mysteries of prayer is that when we make this sacrifice, God blesses and multiplies our time. If you haven't experienced this, try it out. Pray in what might seem to be your craziest day, and you will experience one of the great miracles of prayer. Now, people witnessed Kateri Tekakwitha, the devout laywoman, ever faithful to her everyday duties, spending great amounts of time in prayer, carrying out penances, controlling her passions, avoiding anything superficial in nature, embracing of trials, and preserving her love for God alone. This was her way of the cross. What people didn't always appreciate was how beautiful this journey was for her, that her way of the cross led to a truly resurrected life, life according to the Spirit. And when Francis de Sales first began to write what would become his introduction to a devout life, it was in the form of a series of letters to a cousin of his who was a French aristocrat. The purpose of this great work was to show how life, according to the Spirit, can and should be practiced by everyone, whatever their state in life, whatever their employment or gifts. Now, I think few things can prove his guidance on the subject to be so authoritative than the fact that is perhaps best illustrated by a 17th century Iroquois woman who lived in a world that Francis could only have been very dimly aware of. Now, spiritual warfare and trials are to be expected in the life of a Christian, and we especially see it in the life of great saints. The trial that Kateri went through at the end of her time on the hunt was different in nature than the persecutions that she experienced earlier in her life. Her contemporaries felt that what Kateri was accused of was so inconsistent with her life and involved a matter that was so sensitive to her that it could only be supernatural in nature. She was remarkably composed and at peace and never said anything negative about her accusers. In fact, she didn't even want to know who they were. Kateri simply spoke the truth once and surrendered the matter to God. Now, in our divided times in which love in so many hearts seems to be growing colder, when the dark side of the social media leads us to a culture of insult, we see the relevance of our saint all too well. Now, we often only give ourselves partially to God, and with the usual conditions, that can open us up to failures in our everyday choices and temptations. That is where we can look to Kateri. Her thorough love of the risen Lord enabled her to conquer her spiritual adversaries. She's a beautiful and relevant example for us, inviting us to ask ourselves, am I really in love with Jesus? Is there anything I am withholding from him? Kateri is always leading us to the mercy of God, like all great saints. And our response is, Jesus, I trust in you. Now, her love of her Creator had to find expression, whether she was in the village where she was surrounded by the things that normally supported her life of faith, or when she was in the woods and far from the sacraments. St. Kateri Tekakwitha always discovered the mercy of God wherever she was, and like all great saints, that is where she leads us today.